in his footsteps.
They say that to truly know someone, you need to walk a mile in their shoes. But what does that really mean? It means understanding them, where they come from, what experiences they've had, and where they're heading, what they hope for, what they work for. It means discovering what is important to them and why. It means knowing their heart, what delights them, what fulfills them, and what pains them. This is truly knowing someone, and this is how we want to know Jesus. We can't walk a literal mile in his shoes, but we can retrace his footsteps in the Gospels. He has shared his story and his mission with us, and he has opened his heart to us. To truly love, serve, and be like Jesus, we need to know him, to really know him. This is what In His Footsteps is all about.
We're continuing our study of the Gospel of Luke. I invite you to get the study guide for this episode. It includes the passage we discussed today with reflection questions. Today, we'll look at Luke chapter 1, verses 26 to 38.
This is the story of Gabriel telling Mary that she'll be the mother of the Messiah. But I think it is helpful to set the stage before we dive in.
Luke is a biography of Jesus, but only now, after 25 verses, do we get our first glimpse of Jesus. Why didn't Luke begin with this story?
That's a great question, Rebecca. This passage talks about an incomprehensible miracle, a virgin becoming pregnant. Luke's target audience is the Gentiles. They don't have the history of God's miraculous power.
Luke's telling of Zechariah and Elizabeth is like a prologue to the story of Jesus.
Exactly. Before launching into the miracle of a pregnant virgin, Luke first establishes that God does miracles in people's lives.
And then Luke turns our attention to the announcement of Jesus' birth. Sadly, we don't have time to read the whole passage together, so I encourage you to read it yourself. Let's let our son Christopher read us this week's memory verse.
Nothing is impossible for God.
There are some contrasts between this story and the story of Zechariah.
There are. Gabriel goes from visiting a mature man of faith, a priest, in the spiritual capital of Jerusalem, to visiting a girl somewhere between the ages of 12 and 16 in an obscure village. Nazareth was the brunt of jokes.
But there are still similarities between these stories. Both show God's miraculous work in human history. Gabriel reassured both of them by saying, "Don't be afraid." Remember last week? We touched on that. God is not someone to fear.
It seems Gabriel and his greeting disturbed Mary. He said, "Favored woman, the Lord is with you." I imagine this completely mystified Mary. She's a girl and a virgin. She has no husband or sons to give her status. And she hails from tiny, no good Nazareth. She might wonder why she found favor with God. But Gabriel says it again 2 verses later, almost as a reassurance. You have found favor with God.
It reminds us that God sees differently than humans. Where we see no value, God sees something precious.
That's beautiful. And it's such a comfort whenever we feel like we are invaluable. So why did God see Mary with favor?
Gabriel explains why in verses 31 to 33. He basically says, "You are favored because you are the channel between God and the fulfillment of all his promises since Adam."
Wow, Mary's mind must have exploded with questions. But Luke records only one of them in verse 34. But how can this happen? At first glance, it is similar to Zechariah's question. How can I be sure this will happen?
But when we look closely, we see their questions are very different. Last week, we learned Zachariah's question revealed his doubt. Mary's question, however, is different.
It's more concerned with how the miracle will happen rather than whether she can be sure it will happen.
And what's Gabriel's response? You want to know how it will work? Okay, I'll tell you. In verse 35, Luke mentions the Holy Spirit for the second time. He will mention it 6 more times just in the first 2 chapters of his book. In fact, Luke talks more about the Holy Spirit than any other gospel. He shows how the Holy Spirit works in and through humans to accomplish God's purpose. It is something to pay attention, close attention to as we read through Luke.
And then, to finish his explanation of the how, Gabriel gives these comforting words. They are our memory verse for this week. Nothing is impossible for God.
I actually have something to illustrate this truth. Rebecca, what do you think will happen if I take this pencil and push this pencil into this bag?
I think it's obvious. As you push the pencil, the bag will burst and you'll get all wet. So I hope you brought a towel.
Well, let's see, but let's move the Bible just in case, right? Let's see what happened.
Wow. It's intact. It didn't get you wet.
Yeah. But now, what will happen if I push another pencil in?
I don't think it's going to work this time just because the bag is compromised.
Are you sure about that?
That's how I feel about it.
Let's see.
Wow. I didn't expect that at all to happen. It's incredible.
You know, we look at situations in the world, in history, in our own lives, and we think, it is not possible. But God comes along and says, oh yes, it is possible. With me, nothing is impossible.